Hi everyone, thanks for watching. If you like what I'm doing, please be sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. So very recently I've been reading through the Book of Nehemiah along with my wife and our oldest daughter. And I want to talk a little bit about the Book of Nehemiah, what it's about, what we get from it, why it's important, why you should read it, and how to go about reading it. And then I want to talk about some of the kind of fun and interesting things, details within that story. Because that book of Nehemiah is a story. It's a story narrated by Nehemiah. Now, one thing about the book of Nehemiah that needs to be known by anyone who's going to get into it, it has a lot of lists of names, genealogies, families, locations, lots of lists of names relating to the return of the Jews from Babylon back to Judea, and their relations to each other, their relations before the time of captivity, where they live, lots and lots of emphasis on that. Now, when I read any book of the Bible, I like to read the whole thing all the way through, whether it's some of these pretty tough books, Joshua, the Chronicles, Nehemiah, these books that have long lists of names, chapters and chapters of names. I read through them all. I don't skip those parts. Why? Well, because that's the way they were written. And the reason I'm reading in any part of the Old Testament, these historical books of the Old Testament, is I want to get from it what the author is trying to convey. Now, part of what the author is conveying are these lists of names and genealogies and places and numbers. That's part of the package. And so if I want to understand it, if I want to get it, if I want to gain from it, benefit from it, learn it, then I want to read the whole thing. So I don't like skipping over the so-called boring chapters. Though I will admit, yes, some parts of these books, like Nehemiah, are a bit of a chore to read, but I think the best way to read them is to read the whole thing, start to finish. Don't try to skip anything. When you try skipping, you never know what you'll miss. And for sure, you do know you are going to miss all the information that the author was trying to convey. So, with a book like Nehemiah, well, the book of Nehemiah, why is it important and why should you read the whole thing? Because that is, it's really setting the foundation, it's laying out the story for that age of Judaism. The age of the children of Israel and the Jews ended, with the Babylonian sack of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, just the massacre of the nobility, the enslavement of the nobility, the king is gone. That whole era of the children of Israel ends definitively, violently. It had been predicted for many, many years, and it came to a close, and it was quite definitive, quite an important thing. But then there is a comeback. The Persians allow the Jews to go back, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild their temple, and to even rebuild the wall, and which makes them in some ways powerful and independent once again. So Nehemiah is telling us a important part of that story, of the return, of the rebuilding. It doesn't happen right at the point of return. That's something that some people miss. They think Nehemiah is about leading the people back to Jerusalem and rebuilding Jerusalem. No, Nehemiah actually takes place about 70 years after the original return from captivity. So it's a part of the story, it's an important part of the story, and those importance of reading all those words, reading the book in the whole way that it was written without skipping over things, because you're reading word on word, line on line, the message of the founding of that era of Judaism. All this stuff was very important to them. The story of Nehemiah, those lists of names, those lists of places, it was all important to the authors. It mattered, and it's telling the story of the opening of that age of Judaism, which started with the return from exile and ended when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. So it's an important story. It's setting the stage for an important era of history. And the Book of Nehemiah is interesting and fun to read in itself, and pretty edifying, actually. There's a lot of good that comes out of it. Nehemiah 8 and chapters surrounding it. I'm not real sure exactly what happens in every chapter, but I know Nehemiah 8 is pretty special, where they celebrate the Feast of Booths, and they talk about the joy of the Lord is your strength, and they're reading the law, and the people are weeping because they're overcome with conviction. It's quite a neat story there, and pretty edifying, pretty powerful. Nehemiah is, of course, a very different kind of story from most of the Old Testament, because this isn't happening in a context of the Israelites, or the Jews in this case, being an independent, self-ruling people, as had been the case from Abraham, almost all the way up until that point. They had that time of captivity in Egypt, but most of what we read, most of the narrative, most of the accounts that we read in the Old Testament are Israel as a independent people, and often quite a powerful independent people. In the Book of Nehemiah, it's a completely different dynamic. They are subjects of the Persian Empire, and at that point it's not even seen as a bad thing. They aren't lamenting being under the Persian Empire. Nehemiah is acting as an agent of the Persian Empire. He's a governor on behalf of the king of Persia. And everybody's okay with this. This isn't seen as a problem. It's a new kind of era. New kinds of things are happening. God is showing a new kind of grace on them. Yeah, their kingdom is gone. That whole plan of this empire that the kingdom of Israel was going to rule, it was supposed to be a pretty significant worldly power. But they lost that. But now they're having a comeback. God's having mercy on them. They're rebuilding. They're relearning in a lot of ways. Literally relearning things. Learning how to understand and do things in this new context. And then there's the kind of fun adventure element of Nehemiah. It is largely written as kind of like a military and diplomatic adventure story written by Nehemiah. He comes with this bodyguard of Persians, and they're scouting out Jerusalem. And then he presents himself to the people, and he starts to lead them, and right away they got to get this wall built. They have the authority to do it, and they're working very hard on it. It puts them in a dangerous situation, because building a wall would be like nowadays, getting a missile defense or getting nuclear weapons. It shows everyone around you that you are a power in yourself, and they can't just come and mess with you. So the fact that the king has given them the authority and the permission and the financial aid to do this is pretty significant, and the people around them are very unhappy. The Ammonites and Samaritans, these different peoples who by now for decades have been pretty happy with the situations of the Jews, who were once very powerful, the Jews being weak, beaten down, no longer the superpower of that part of the world. Well, now the Jews are rebuilding, they're making a comeback, the people around them are pretty scared, pretty upset, and they try very hard to sabotage it. Now, they had successfully sabotaged it before, when a Babylonian appointed governor, a Jewish governor appointed by Babylon, named Gedaliah, was trying to lead the Jewish people in rebuilding their lives. These were the Jewish people who remained, who were not taken away captives. He was trying to lead them in kind of rebuilding their lives to try to bring back some prosperity. Jeremiah was working with him, and a group of Ammonites attacked, murdered Gedaliah, murdered the Babylonians that were present with him, killed a bunch of other people, and just the whole thing kind of collapsed. People lost faith and fled and abandoned Judea. So what Nehemiah is doing is a personally dangerous endeavor. He is putting his life on the line, and he has these companions who come with him from the court of the Persian king, these Persian companions, and they are really, in a big way, some of his main supporters, because they are loyal to him, and he is in turn loyal to the Jewish people So Nehemiah and his men are in this state of constant vigilance while they're trying to get that wall up as fast as possible. And he knows that there are people even among the Jews who are compromised, who have ties with some of these other surrounding peoples, with Ammonites and Sumerians and Edomites and Philistines and whatnot. And what's going on within Jerusalem, word of that is going out to Nehemiah's enemies. And so it's a pretty tense period, these weeks as they're building the wall. At one point, Nehemiah says how, they didn't change their clothes except to wash. They kept their armor on. At one point, even the workers are taking shifts, standing guard with bows and spears, or working on the wall. It's a pretty exciting time, and pretty scary if you're Nehemiah or the people that are building the wall. They're trying to get that wall up as fast as possible, so then it will be a done fact. Change the facts on the ground, as they say, and be safe. And they succeed. They get that wall done. They aren't murdered by their enemies, as their enemies have been conspiring against them to do. And at some point, they hold a festival of booths, and it turns into a celebration. They celebrate the law. They do good to each other. They help the poor. Nehemiah puts an end to the debt slavery that's going on. And at one point, he goes back to Persia. I guess he gets recalled or something. I'm not sure exactly what happens. Hey, read the Book of Nehemiah, and then he comes back to Judea later and finds that there's some problems going on there that he has to solve again. Now, towards the end of the book, things get a little interesting, where I think we start seeing some of the signs of the weakness in this new age of Judaism, this new restoration of their faith and worship, because we see the roots of the extreme legalism that Jesus runs into when he comes along 450 years later or so. Nehemiah is a huge stickler for the Sabbath and is very, very strict on it. He uses violence, like light violence, beating and whatnot on people who break the Sabbath. And it's understandable, what the Jewish people had went through, that generational trauma that they had been through, and now they are trying to make a comeback. But we know that extreme legalism, extreme following of their interpretation of the law wasn't what was going to save them. It wasn't the great goal that God had for them. But Nehemiah's an admirable character, and I think he's doing his best. And yeah, those last few chapters get a little interesting. I think it's fine to kind of read that with a critical eye and kind of see the good and see what maybe was a bit of a weakness. This is a historical book. Nehemiah isn't being held up as someone that we have to agree with and emulate in every aspect. But yeah, the poor guy, he's putting up with a lot. And he himself is a very faithful, devoted person, really cares for the people, trying to do the right thing and doing the right thing. There's this funny scene, when he comes back from Persia, back to Jerusalem, and he finds things are a bit of a mess. And he finds that one of his enemies, who had been trying to kill him, is now living in Jerusalem. He has his own quarters set up in the temple, I think it is, because he is a relation of the Jewish priest. And so Nehemiah literally kicks him out of the temple, throws out all his furniture, and he's pretty distressed by the whole thing. And then he's, running around beating people for breaking the law. It's there's parts that get a little bit hectic, I think, to the point of comical in a way. Well, that's my way of taking it. So anyhow, it's a good book, as are all the books in the Bible, and I hope that you read it, and I hope that you like it. And hey, if you want to leave some comments on what I've said here, what you think about the Book of Nehemiah, please, hey, let's have a conversation. That's just one of the funnest things to do. Read the Bible and share with each other about it. Okay, bye for now.